This is the final lecture for Chapter 2, and in this I'm going to be reviewing the 10 principles of brain and behavior. And this is the concluding section of Chapter 2, and so this will review what we've basically gone through in terms of overarching concepts that you want to understand about the brain and behavior in Chapters 1 and in Chapter 2. So Principle 1, the nervous system produces movement within a perceptual world that the brain creates. This is really important because this really gets to the heart of the subjective nature of the brain. Individual realities are rough approximations of what is actually present. When I was standing in front of the class earlier today, if someone else had been standing up there next to me and we could literally take a photograph and compare what I saw versus what the other person saw and present that to somebody else, then you would see that there's actually quite substantial differences in like what types of things we perceive as red, even probably how darkly we perceive different people's skin tones. All of this is based upon our experiences and our past, and the brain produces a reality that is a function of our past experiences. And one question that I got was like, well, is this something that's really perceptual, such as if like how you can look different on TV? Well, it's actually much, much more intimate than that. This really reflects biases that we have, and how our brain adapts for us to survive. So if there's things that we don't know, our brain actually tries to fill those gaps in, and it fills those gaps in with things that we already know. So we tend to see a bit more of what we expect to see, and what people don't realize is how much what we expect to see differs, and so how much we actually see differs. So what the behavior that the brain produces is directly related to the world that we perceive. So the behavior we produce relates to what we perceive, and this can be also as intimate as if we're sensitive about certain things. An example that I gave in one of my prior classes is when I was younger, I used to think that my nose was too big, and so I would actually be sensitive to it, that people might look at it. And of course now I realize that, well, one, my nose is not that big, and regardless, most of the time people really don't actually care. That's something that we perceive that can be a bit of a big deal. Most other people are not. And that is just sort of a silly example, though, of how there are certain things that we can become very fixated on that other people don't even notice, and vice versa, and that actually happens a great deal. So the behavior we produce is really directly related to the world that our brain perceives and has created. Okay, Principle 2. So the details of the nervous system functioning are constantly changing an attribute called neuroplasticity. So it's pretty amazing that how plastic our brain is, and how plastic, by that I mean how constantly changing it is. Right now, your brain is different at this moment than it was a minute ago. You are taking in new information. There are different patterns of activity. Each thing that we experience alters the brain's organization, and this fundamental change in this fundamental physical change is required for learning and memory, and it also is really supportive for elements of our survival. So if we were not able to adapt to our environment, then we would really not be able to survive. And what is really amazing is how the default for our brains is change, and as opposed to staying static, that everything that comes in affects us, and we're constantly changing. And we have this, I think our capacity for plasticity and for change is actually one of the things that separates us from other less evolved species. Principle 3. So many of the brain circuits are crossed. Each hemisphere actually receives sensory stimulation from the opposite. So this is a contralateral organization of the hemispheres. So the left side of my brain controls the right side of my body, and the right side of my brain controls the left side of my body. It's not really too understood why this has occurred, this contralateral organization has occurred on an evolutionary perspective. There's some thought in that when we sort of first evolved, that really sort of left to right was actually sort of on the bottom, sort of top to bottom, and then as we evolved, it sort of changed to become stuff that was left to right, but lots of that is really just speculation. But you really need to know right controls left, left controls right. Principle 4, the central nervous system functions on multiple levels. So simple animals have a spinal cord, more complex animals have a brainstem, and then even more complex animals have evolved a forebrain. So each new addition to the central nervous system has added a new level of behavioral complexity without discarding previous levels of control. And this is really important, that you have these multiple levels and that you have one on top of the other, that we actually, as evolved as we are, still have these very early drives and animalistic instincts, and that it is in our best interest to be mindful of these because they still affect our behavior a great deal. And so, of course, one of the, aside from the drive to eat and physically sustain ourselves from food, one of the primary animalistic drives that we have would be our sex drive or our desire to mate and pass on our genes. We have cultural overtones to how we think about our propagation and our sex drive, but as much as we have cultural overtones, we have real strong biological mechanisms that very much want to perpetuate our genes. And so the best way to properly think about these sort of evolutionary urges, basically, is to realize that they're there and know that they are for what they are, and that they are something that is natural and a part of our survival, and that we have evolved with our higher order cognitive functions to control these more animalistic or instinctual behaviors. Okay, so principle 5, the brain is both symmetrical and asymmetrical. Okay, so on the whole, sort of look like mirror images, but they have some unique features. While we have a right temporal lobe and a left temporal lobe, we have a right hippocampus and a left hippocampus, they actually tend to have a slightly different expertise. So language is usually on the left. So if you're right-handed, it's like 99% that your language is on the left, and spatial functions are usually on the right. If you are left-handed, however, then it's about a 50-50 chance that your language is on the left and your language is on the right. There's also other differences in terms of some processing music, different types of sound, even some valence thing, whether things are positive or negative. So there are subtle dissimilarities. Principle 6. So the brain systems are organized both hierarchically and in parallel. There are multiple levels of function, and these levels must be extensively interconnected to integrate their processing and create unified perceptions or movements. So this can be, level 4 could be very small individual features or very small individual movements, like a little tiny move of your finger. But even to do something like this, that I would need to move like a tiny finger in a certain way to, like, I don't know, play the flute or something like that, then they're going to have to be all sorts of, if I were to play the flute, then I'd have to be able to organize the movement of all of my hands in parallel. But then even within these movements, this has to be hierarchically organized and controlled by other parts of my brain. So this interconnectedness is really essential for the ways that we can perceive elements and how we respond and how we behave and the motor movements we make. Another interesting thing that's important here is this hierarchical organization. Information doesn't just travel up from level 4 to 3 to 2. We also have influences that travel down. So this is called top-down control or top-down influence, where what's up here actually influences what you perceive down here. So a good example of this in terms of phrasing is you see what you expect to see. And so if we see what we expect to see, then it's not just that basic sensory information is coming in, is that our own expectations, which are higher order cognitive functions or expectations, is influencing our actual perceptions. And so we have bottom-up influences basically from the environment, and we have top-down things that also occur from our expectations and our goals. All right, principle 7 and 8. So principle 7, sensory and motor divisions exist throughout the nervous system. So basically, the differences between sensory perceiving and motor acting, and that there are separate systems. So the motor is in the regions of the frontal lobe, so in controlling movement, and sensory is in the front part of the parietal. And so this is a somatosensory system. This is where you're going to have sensory representations. So these are very distinct, sensing and acting. And relatedly, principle 8, sensory input to the brain is divided for object recognition and motor control. So that a squirrel, for example, can perceive a nut, but then have the motor control to be like, oh, I'm going to reach for that nut. So those are two different things, that you're going to have this object identification and you're going to have the behavioral response to that object. And those are actually different. And they occur in parallel. So you can, and we'll be talking about this later on, but you can have damage in object recognition, so you wouldn't actually be able to say what something is, but you can still know how to interact with it. Relatedly, in terms of these sort of separate systems with regards to brain damage, the separate systems is also very protective, so that it would be very hard, for example, for you to have brain damage that was so severe that you would totally lose language, because even if you can produce language, which would be an element of motor control, you would be able to possibly comprehend other people's language, and which would be more in line with object recognition. So you may not be able to produce a language, but you could understand what the other person is saying. And then principle 9, functions in the brain are both localized and distributed. So this relates to what I was ending with a little bit in principle 8. So damage to a small brain region might only produce very focal symptoms. You can actually have very focal damage that can result in trouble naming very specific things, like trouble naming fruits or vegetables, or trouble naming tools, okay? But massive brain damage is required to completely remove some functions. And if you have these really massive damage, then you're going to have you can have much more widespread dysfunction than one particular type of behavior. So while a small injury could impair like one aspect of language functioning, again, it would take this very widespread injury to completely remove all language abilities. And then principle 10, the nervous system works by juxtaposing excitation and inhibition. You're going to be learning more about this in chapter 3. So all neurons have a spontaneous rate of activity that can be either increased excitation or decreased inhibition. So basically, your brain is never completely and totally at rest. So this is some of the, if you've ever seen these movies where they say, oh, like only 20% of our brain is active at one time. What would happen if our brain was all active at the same time? What would we be able to possibly do as humans if we were to have 100% of our brain active? Well, that's a little bit of a misnomer, because a neuron can basically be either firing or not firing. And you really wouldn't not want all of the neurons to be firing at once. Because I can tell you, if all of your neurons are firing at once, then basically what you're having is a seizure. So you don't really want all of your brain to be active. You want a pattern of active and inactive. And the particular patterns of activity and inactivity are what correspond with certain behaviors, certain representations. And so when you're engaging and trying to think about something new, then you are having a, goal-directed, changes in terms of, oh, this is going to become more active here, and this is going to become less active, and this at a fundamental sort of activation pattern level will change some of the representations in your brain. And so this is pretty much the end of chapter 2. And chapter 3, we're going to be learning a lot more about neurons and how they engage in communication through an action potential and firing. So that's all for now.